So let me say a little bit more. Let me say a little bit more about those last 2 points. So there was created the Supreme Rabbinical Council, and it was given all types of authority to define these things that I was talking about at the end of the last video. So basically, who was a Jew? What it was given power over things like marriage, divorce, confirmation of wills, and the determination of who would be qualified as a Jew, and that was determined in 1953. So this Supreme Rabbinical Council was given these authorities over pretty significant things: marriage, divorce, wills, and who it would define who a Jew is. And these courts were controlled by primarily Orthodox rabbis. Now, in modern Judaism, there are basically, you have the Orthodox, you have conservative, and you have Reformed. Okay. Of the Jews practicing in Israel during that time, living in Israel, only about a third were really practicing some form of Orthodox Judaism. Okay. And Orthodox rabbis have the more strict interpretations, but they were essentially given right over all these interpretations of those issues I just talked about. Okay, so this further reinforced the Jewish nature of Israel as a state. Ben Gurion and others had thought, there would be a separation of religion and state over time. And their early policies of basically appealing to these Orthodox rabbis for political reasons kept that from happening, essentially, and in fact reinforced the position of the Orthodox rabbis in Israeli society. Among the Muslim and Christian Arabs, the non-Jewish communities in Israel, you almost had something similar to the millet system that was under the Ottomans, at least in judicial matters. So they were treated as different under these different judicial matters, and the distinction was made in their own national identity cards between Jewish and Arab. Okay. So nationality in Israel became more and more equated with being Jewish. That's one thing to understand. Another two examples of the Orthodox rabbis' influence on Israel would be: one, the enforcement of Sabbath laws. On the Sabbath in Israel, and I think this is still the case, urban transportation is shut down, at least between cities. So there's no public transportation. Most restaurants, public entertainment are closed. The national airline did not operate. Buses are limited. Okay. The Sabbath was also observed in West Jerusalem and Tel Aviv or Haifa even more strictly than in other places. In some places, the religious rabbis and religious people would block off the roads, and I think that still happens in Israel, in modern Israel, current Israel today. The military even was forced to follow kosher dietary laws. In the realm of education, a parent could choose whether their kid would go to a religious school or a secular school, and both forms of school are funded by the Israeli government. Okay? So those are some other points on that issue. Let's talk about Israeli security and foreign policy. One of the things that's important to think about is, in the Israeli mentality, especially during the 50s and 60s, Israel saw themselves as under siege constantly by the Arab states surrounding them. Okay? And this really influences their actions in regard to military actions, and it also shapes their entire foreign policy, and it still does to some extent. They still, it's not quite as bad I don't think in most Israelis' minds today as it was in the 50s and 60s, but it definitely shaped the way they saw the way they saw society and how they would spend their money and on military things and how society would be organized. Okay, so that's important. The military was based on an extensive reserve system. So it permitted, so you didn't have to have this huge army. Everybody didn't have to be in the army constantly, but there would be a very large military reserve system so people could be called up at times of national emergency. All Israelis, so every Israeli citizen was drafted or conscripted into the armed forces at the age of 18. Men for 3 years and women for 2 years. So, under this system, all Israelis you'd have to serve in the military if you're a man for 2 years, if you're a man for 3 years, a woman for 2. The only exceptions to this were ultra-religious Jews and women who had certain family responsibilities. They would be exempted. Oh, Arab Israelis were not required to serve either in the military. The other way to keep people in readiness mode, though, all the time was that they would have to have a fair amount of constant training. So the reservist would have to be trained in you would have to do active training over time. I don't know if it was every weekend or every other weekend or once a month, I'm not sure. But every man into his mid-40s was considered part of the reserve and would do active training. Every woman into her mid-30s. Okay? So you can see why this was so important. You also could imagine how this could be disruptive to education, civilian career planning, and many other things, okay? But you can also see why they would have thought it was necessary. Ben-Gurion, early on, who he really shaped, the 50s and the 60s, particularly the 50s and into the early 60s, Israeli thinking, put in place what's called a retaliation in force policy. Okay? What did this policy mean? It meant if we are aggressed against, if the Arabs around us try to do something, we will respond in usually a disproportionate way of force against the initial act. So if they hit us, we're going to hit them back 3 times as hard, so they'll never want to do it again. Okay? That's what I mean by that. And an example of this is February 1955. February 1955, there were Egyptian positions in Gaza. So Gaza was controlled by Egypt after 1949, okay? And there were 38 Egyptians were killed by this Israeli strike in Gaza of February 1955. And they felt like they were responding to what they felt like was Egyptian aggression. But the Egyptians had not acted in the same forceful way that they had. So my point is that they retaliated 3 times as hard as what the Egyptian action had originally been. Okay? Now, they, in a way, this kind of backfired. I would say it backfired. Now, on one side, certainly the Arabs knew that if they did something, the Israelis might hit them back really hard, right? But on the other side of that, instead of making the Arabs want to make a peace deal, it made the Arabs on their side say, okay, well, if they're going to hit us back hard, then we better reinforce our military, okay? So it kind of led to a policy of ratcheting it up on both sides. The other fear the Arabs had was what they feared as Israel's expansionist policy. Many Arab rulers around them, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, etc., believed that Israel really had this strong expansionist policy. And there were, frankly, some Israelis that did. I remember that was the revisionist program. But the revisionists weren't in control completely. Now, once you look ahead at what has happened over time, maybe some of the Arabs' fears were founded. But a lot of that was actually a lot of the Israeli expansion from the Israeli perspective was done because of actions the Arabs did first. At least I'm just trying to give you both sides there. So after this Gaza Strip raid, where a bunch of these Egyptians were killed here, Abdul Nasser, the president of Egypt, decided to make a deal. And I think I'll mention that later. He decided to make a deal. The Egyptians made a deal to get more weapons from the Czechs and the Soviets. Okay, during that time. All right, another thing to point out during this period in the 1960s was, in foreign policy in the 1960s, the United States and Israel began to come closer together. And this happened particularly under the Johnson and Nixon administrations. Okay? So Johnson becomes president in 1963. Remember, Kennedy is assassinated. Johnson becomes president. Nixon becomes president. He's elected president in 1968. So we're talking about from about 63 to 73, basically. And during this time period, in the 60s, U.S. and Israel come closer together. In the 50s, Israel's policy was, remember we're talking about the Cold War. Israel actually tried to be kind of in the middle of the Cold War, in the sense that Israel tried to be friendly with both the USSR and the USA. There are a lot of reasons for why that changed. Some of it is because the United States connection to Israel the U.S. policy to Israel changed. But also the Israelis came to see the Soviet Union as promoting a more pro-Arab policy. So that's another reason why that changed. Okay? There's a picture of David Ben-Gurion in his older age, a color picture. Remember, he served till 1963 as high-ranking official in the Israeli government. Now, this leads us up to a very important event. And that event is known as the 6-Day War. Now, I'm going to come back and talk about Egypt some more developments, talking about Egypt by itself. But I'm going to mention a few things now because it's important to realize, okay? The 6-Day War, also known as the June War, because it took place in June 1967, was war between Israel and primarily Egypt and Syria. And Jordan was also involved. Okay? So I'm going to say more about all those at the end of this video, and probably in the next video. So, as I was saying, the Soviet Union did start supplying Arab states with weapons, and this started in the 50s. So this was, again, part of the Cold War, where the Soviets were trying to get their client states. And this, again, is another reason why in the 60s the U.S. gravitated more towards the Israelis. So the Soviets sold arms, for instance, to Egypt, Syria, and Iraq during this time. Also, the Arab rhetoric, especially in Egypt at the time, in the 1950s, and going into the 60s, focused strongly on liberating the Arabs from Israeli occupation. That's the way they saw it. And they promoted Arab unity as a way for Arabs to go forward, and that Arab unity would be based on a military victory over Israel. Okay? There were also frequent clashes along the Jordanian-Israeli border during the 1960s. So, just so you understand, the West Bank was controlled by Jordan up to 1967. So the Golan Heights was part of Syria. Okay? So there were a lot of Palestinian groups that were also living